to watch that happen, because I got into science for the science. I didn't get into it for the politics. And both men and women always empathize more with the female victim in those scenarios. There were people, staff at the university, including the executive dean of the school I was working in. They were sort of scheming to cancel. To be honest, I'm glad to be out of that toxic environment and move on to other things. It's what a lot of people will call gynocentrism. It's a broad societal concern more for girls and women than boys and men.
I think this gives me direction to go into the next part of what you actually wrote about. You called men's issues as a national health, and you've stated that men have worse health outcomes but fewer dedicated public health resources than women. I want to understand what data points in general on mental health or suicides or homelessness, injuries, joblessness, shelters, or dedicated departments or magazines, for example. What information, you said you collected a lot of information. Can you help us or share some data on this?
Yeah, one of the reasons I wrote that paper, which is now a few years old, is a big sort of epidemiological review on the status of men's health. So I go through and identify various physical or mental health conditions or other kind of well-being measures where men are doing worse than women are. And the reason I did that is because when I was challenging that ACSM position paper, all I wanted to do was include a reference, which was a review paper that described the status of men's health and summarized all these different prevalence rates of all these different things like suicide and homelessness and all the rest. And I couldn't find a good reference. So I actually wrote the paper because I was frustrated that I couldn't myself find that reference. And yeah, so I just go through a list, and you named some of the key ones there. For me, it always starts with the life expectancy difference, because then what you can do is you can work backwards. So you can say, okay, we've got a life expectancy difference of, let's say, 5 years in your country. Okay, what explains that difference? Why are males dying younger? And then you go through all these different causes. So suicide, then you've got different types of accidents. So motor vehicle accidents, drug overdose deaths, alcohol induced deaths like drunk driving. Then you have things like drownings. Then you have workplace fatalities. So, working in dangerous jobs. And so those are all examples that that will really cause that life expectancy difference, because those are ways of dying that will get men when they're young, right? And so they'll really create a large life expectancy gap. But then you have other things too, like in the United States, for example. I think many people would be surprised to learn that men are actually more likely to die from cancer than women are. But you don't
Okay.
really
Yeah.
hear very much either. So yeah, and then there's certain, on kind of the more psychological level now, using our current sort of diagnostic tools or surveys, women are more likely to have anxiety and depression. When you sort of get to the male side of things, you're talking a little bit more like autism spectrum. You're talking about sort of like language and speech disorders, like developmental sorts of disorders and hearing issues and things like that.
Understood. One of the things I want to go a little deeper into the fact is the life expectancy, and you gave certain reasons for why men could probably be dying a little earlier by 5-6 years. And this is a pattern across the world, not just United States. One of the things you mentioned is accidents. Of course, maybe men drive a little more rashly, or they're drunk and then they're driving. It could be a combination. But you also mentioned a lot of drug-related deaths, suicides, and alcohol plus drowning. Uh, is there any proclivity or, let's say, brain related or neurological wiring that propels or, let's say, directs men into these directions of, let's say, drug abuse or alcohol related deaths?
Yeah. Well, I think it's all risk taking. So it's kind of
Hmm.
risk taking behavior. And, and then you come to the question of, well, what the heck do you do about that? And,
Yeah.
I'm not sure. It's tricky because I do think it's biologically driven for the most part, but there are social aspects to it. Like if you're with a group of male friends and you're a young guy and your male friends are saying, "Oh man, you need to go for it. You need to I don't know, try to jump over this thing," right? And it's actually quite dangerous to do it. And especially like if you're drinking alcohol and you're drunk and you jump into a body of water, like maybe you're out on a boat and they dare you to jump out into the water or something like that. And there you go. There you've got a drowning death, right? So in that case, there will be it's always hard to separate these things out, the biological drive and the social. I think they always are almost always kind of going hand in hand in some way. So it's not really clear the best way to address some of these issues. The I guess the one way you would try to do it is through education programs of some kind, or particularly if you're getting good information from your father. I think that would have a big impact. But one of the issues here with education is that even though, particularly like in the U.S. and Australia, where boys and men are sort of behind girls and women in education, we're actually not allowed to talk about that issue very much either because of the gynocentrism. So even if you thought the solution was to have a specific focus on education for boys and young men about these different topics, we're we're not allowed to talk about boys and men having any sort of special kind of education because it is believed that that is sort of somehow hating on girls and women, which of course it is not.
One of the things that you said actually bothered me, right? You mentioned that some of the reasons ascribed to men's, let's say, early dying rates, or the reasons are not properly studied, or there is not conclusive evidence describing why it is so. Obviously, I would think, as a layman, not an academic, that maybe if people do more research on these topics, maybe they can find some answers, is what I would be thinking. Now, w- does this kind of tell me that there's not enough research done on these topics for men? Like, would that be a fair assumption to make?
Well, we have the epidemiological data that show us like the number of deaths and all of that. But I think where we're lacking is sort of a true understanding of how some of these things play out in terms of um, the social dynamics. For example, that scenario I gave, if you're out on the boat and drinking and someone jumps off and drowns. Okay, what was really going on there from like a psychological standpoint? And I think maybe that's where we're lacking. Like, and part of it I think stems from that we sort of just view males as more disposable. So we just say, "Oh, well, yep, was being a silly man again, and there he goes, and he drowns, or there he goes, drunk driving." But if you peel back the layers, let's take a drunk driving accident for example. Uh, why was he drinking? Why was he drinking in the first place? That's sort of like the questions we need to ask. Because if you peel back that layer, you might find out maybe he lost someone in his family. He didn't, or he's broke up with a girlfriend or something. Maybe he has sort of been like alienated from his kids or something like that. And, and he's stressed out and that alcohol is giving him some sort of relief. And then he drives and then accident and he's dead. But because we sort of have a thinking toward, oh, that's just a man doing a man thing, and yep, he's going to die earlier, and he's just more disposable. We don't tend to get, I think, to the root causes of what's driving the behavior.
That's quite obvious, right, James? I mean, you see that people in academia or even in accredited bodies like UN, WHO, everybody is publishing articles and research on women's well-being, being a gynocentric society, but we don't see similar research done on men's health or related issues. That brings me to the next point that you made in one of the blogs that you wrote. You've noted men's health is rarely treated as a distinct field of biomedical research. Why do you think academia has been slow or resistant to recognize it as a unique discipline?
Yeah, I think it's because of some of the things we're talking about. There's maybe the actual biological orientation we have toward caring more about girls and women. So you've got that. You've got the gynocentrism, and then once you've kind of got a narrative going, so the women's health movement, from the U.S. perspective, really took off in the early 1990s, and and they have kept alive a lot of the narratives that were going on at that time. They still keep those going today. So even though women are living longer lives, then what they do is they just tweak the narrative slightly. So now that women in terms of the US, women have almost always had higher, longer life expectancy. But what they do now, because people are actually starting to acknowledge the sex difference in life expectancy and giving more attention to males, you'll notice that what's happening in the women's health movement is they're now focusing on quality of life. So they're saying, "Oh, yeah, women live longer, but they live more years in disability," or something like that.
Ah.
So what they do is they always tweak the message to maintain female victimization narrative.
Mm.
Yeah. And that they've been doing this for 30 some 35 years now in the women's sort of health space. And I'm not saying that women's health does not deserve attention. It deserves attention. I'm just trying to point out the bias that exists that perhaps prevents men's health from getting the attention that it needs.
I think this is quite fascinating. I have to tell you one of the research papers that I read. I'm sure you would have come across it. It's called "The Paradox of Declining Women's Happiness." Apparently, they say that as feminism, let's say, prevailed and became more popular and got imbibed, right from 1960s, the all the waves that people went through in the US. Apparently, the happiness index of women has reduced significantly over time, in spite of them having all rights and more rights than what men actually have today. Probably that could be another reason they'll feel victimized and feel sorry about their situation. So, but yeah, the next question I have for you, James, is you've written something about gamma bias. I mean, that's a new word that I came across, and empathy gap. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so the credit to that concept goes to two psychologists and psychological researchers in England, Martin Seeger and John Barry. And John Barry is the founder for the Center for Male Psychology. And
Yeah.
yeah, and John and Martin are, in my opinion, the leaders in the area of male psychology. They will be able to explain gamma bias much better than me, but I'll give it a go. But make sure, if you're listening to this, you check out their work, because they have YouTube videos on it and everything. But the idea with it is that we tend to um, we tend to emphasize female victimization and minimize male victimization. And then, on the other hand, when something good is done, we tend to sort of um, celebrate female achievement, but not male achievement. Meaning that we link the sex or gender in any time we want to, when we're emphasizing victimization, we we link in the sex or gender when it's about women.
Hmm.
When we want to kind of celebrate achievement, we specifically focus on the sex and gender when it's about women. So you'll see all these stories all the time. You know, the first woman to ever achieve this, or so they really emphasize the sex or gender, but when it's a woman that's achieving something, but they rarely do it when it's a man. And so that's what the whole gamma bias thing is all about. And And it's believed that that is part of what leads to the empathy gap, where we have more empathy for girls and women and less empathy for boys and men.
I also think people are quite selective in even celebrating that. For example, in Indian context, I mean, or even in the world context, people will celebrate a woman CXO, for example, or someone who invented something new, or a rocket scientist or a pilot, for example. But they don't have the same yardstick for celebrating a woman who's laying bricks or driving a auto rickshaw or driving a bus or something which demands a little more uh, physical labor. That's not celebrated. So I do think that it's quite selective in terms of asking for even reservations in jobs plus sectors that look glorified and famous. That's how it
Yeah,
appears to me. Yeah,
interesting.
it's quite so let's move to the next section, James. I think we've discussed a lot about the psychological aspects and the male epidemics and stuff. I want to go into the topic that fascinated you as a child, as a boy in school. Strength as primary health metric. You've been a strong proponent of that. Strength versus cardio. Men generally focus, let's say, on cardio for heart health. Based on your research into muscle strength and mortality, why should resistance training be the higher priority for longevity?
Yeah, well, I would argue that they should both go together. And that's why the public health guidelines are set out the way they are, is the focus on both the cardiovascular and the muscle strength aspect. Um, but the two will go together. So let me give you an example. Let's say you're getting a bit older as a man and you don't have good muscle strength. And as a result, you have a fall. And during the fall, you maybe break your hip or something, and you're in hospital and you're laid up in hospital for a couple weeks. And as a result of laying in bed for a couple of weeks, your cardiovascular health is actually going to go down as well because you're not able to get out and around and walk around. So, in that particular example that I just gave, the key factor was actually having adequate muscle strength to prevent you from falling, right? Which is then what got you laid up in the bed for a couple weeks and your cardiovascular health went down because you're not out and about walking anymore, right? So for me, I always view these things as usually kind of linked in different ways like that. But historically, it's the cardiovascular aspect that's gotten all the attention, like through the media. But that is starting to change now. We've been doing research on strength training for many, many decades now. It used to be thought that lifting weights was dangerous, right? So you get hurt your knee, or you're gonna hurt your back when you're doing deadlifts and stuff. And it took a while to overcome that false narrative. Of course, you can get injured doing anything really, but on the whole, doing strength training with weights or other machines, we want you that is in your long-term benefit to do that because as you age, past, I don't know, the age maybe roughly 50, 55, your strength is gonna start to decrease. So we want to try to maintain that, for as long as we can, and that even means lifting weights when you're an older adult. We used to really think of, um, older adults as being very frail and they shouldn't exercise because it's gonna be too dangerous for them. Well, what do you want them to do? Just sit around all day? Like, how is that good for them? Like, they're human beings. Like, we are meant to of course, it's gonna be more difficult to move around when you get older, but you're still meant to try, right? To do whatever you can. And so we now have physical activity, strength training recommendations, for older adults too.
Can you, I mean, since you've done a lot of research in strength training on the neural adaptations and strength, can you explain what is the difference in a person? Let's take somebody in mid 40s, 45, right? Let's take someone who strength trains and someone who doesn't. What difference can someone see in their, let's say, musculature and the way the brain functions? Is there any literature around that that you can explain us?
Okay, if we were to see a difference in terms of the brain function, um, the main outcome we would look at is something called voluntary activation. And voluntary activation is a measurement of how well your brain and your spinal nerves can work together to drive your muscle to create its maximal possible force. So all of our muscles, our skeletal muscles, they are controlled by our brain through the spinal nerves that then go out to the muscles, and these nerves communicate with the muscles. They tell the muscles when to squeeze and create force. Um, this is a property of the human nervous system that we can measure in the lab. So what we would do is we would get someone in a sort of a specialized setup where we ask them to pull against a handle as hard as they can. And while they're doing that, we zap their nerves. And if while they're pulling in on that device, we get a little extra twitch out of their muscle, which creates a little extra force. Because remember, they're pulling as hard as they possibly can, right? And we get a little extra force out of it. That means that their nervous system was not fully voluntarily activating the muscle. So they've got a bit of a deficit there.
Oh,
Yeah. Okay. And now let me take an extreme example and then I'll come back to your question. People that have motor impairments, like neurological impairments, so stroke, spinal cord injury, for example, these individuals, because of the damage they have in their nervous system, they have significantly reduced voluntary activation levels. And that's why they one of the reasons why they get weaker is because their nervous system can no longer communicate with the muscle in the same way that it used to when they were healthy. Now, getting back to your question is if you take someone who's like a weightlifter and you compare them to someone who's not a weightlifter, will you see a difference in voluntary activation? That's kind of I think the question you're asking. And my suspicion, I know that they've done these studies, and I'm just trying to remember them off the top of my head. I don't think the sample sizes have been very big. If there is a difference, the weightlifters would be a little bit better in in doing that. So that's my answer. But where you see the biggest difference is when you actually have a really legit like neurological um, impairment.
so that then brings me to another question. I'm very curious about this voluntary activation and the way the nerves function. Is there a way a common man or a woman sitting at home can they identify if their voluntary activation is optimal or at special? I mean, there must be some basic metric with which it's defined. You explained using the handle pull or a grip, for example. How can I find out at home if my, let's say, nerves, brain, and the spinal nerves are all functioning well, and that my voluntary activation is at its best?
It's such a great question because we don't have a way to do that. We don't have a good practical the technology to do it in at home. The way that we do it in the lab, it involves stimulating the nerves, so at a high intensity as well. So there's issues around safety and stuff, but no one has given it a go. The reason why I'm interested in that question is because when I was doing more of that type of research a few years ago, I was trying to think of ways. How is there some way technologically we could advance this and make it so people could assess it on themselves, like make it safe and feasible and all that. And I just wasn't able to come up with a good idea. So you're absolutely right. Like it's such an interesting topic, but we don't have a good way of measuring it. But now think of this: the cardiovascular stuff we do have better ability to measure that at home. So you can you can buy a Garmin watch that has a heart rate monitor on it, right? Um, you get your step counts. You can wear a heart rate monitor strap around your chest. So those are ways of measuring more of like your cardiovascular activity and your cardiovascular health. But we don't have the equivalent sort of thing that you can wear around all day that assesses how much or how often you're using your muscle, like in terms of the nervous system inputs. Um, well, I take that back. There's been one attempt that I'm aware of, but it's not very feasible right now, and that is there was a group, maybe it was in Japan. They developed like almost a pair of really tight shorts, like spandex shorts or briefs, and and in the cloth or the fabric of the shorts, which like went down to the knee, there were all these sensors. It was what we call electromyography. There were all these sensors which were meant to measure the the nervous system activation of the muscles throughout the daily activities. So that's one way to try to do it, but then it's not feasible. Like how many people want to go around all day? Like it's easy to wear this watch, right? It can be fashionable and everything, but how do you make it fashionable to measure nervous system activity, you know, throughout your everyday life? We don't have it yet.
It's quite, I mean, probably, up for future research. Maybe somebody will find a better way to track it, considering how important it is. Generally, there has been a lot of research around, let's say, grip strength as a good proxy for a biomarker for longevity as well. Why do you think that is established that way?
Well, grip strength tends to correlate with muscle strength of other muscle groups. That's why it's you. Well, the reason that it's used so much in research and in clinical practice is because it's the easiest strength measurement to take. Um, and think about it from the clinician's or doctor's standpoint. It's pretty easy to administer the test without having much training in it yourself, right? You just say, "Hey, here's this grip strength dynamometer, just squeeze as hard as you can." So it's easy for the participant and it's easy for the doctor or the nurse. And that's one reason why. It's because it's more feasible to measure. And they're relatively cheap devices, all things considered. And grip strength does correlate with strength of other muscle groups. It's not a perfect correlation, and that's where it gets criticized because people will say, "Oh, well, your grip strength isn't, exactly similar to, your leg strength, and leg strength is more important than grip strength." But the problem, it's a trade-off. The problem is if you then want to start measuring muscle strength from other muscle groups, it's more difficult to get those measurements from participants or patients. You have to train up the doctors or the nurses on
Hmm.
how to use the more specialized equipment better. So then if people aren't trained up on it very well on how to do it properly, then you get inaccurate recordings. Whereas grip strength, most people can get it. You just squeeze
Get it
something
right.
hard. And that's why it's used so much. And because it does, there are all these studies that show that um, grip strength tends to correlate with life expectancy and some other measurements.
Got it. I think that explains it really well. During the initial part of our conversation, you mentioned about propelling our bodies through space. So I want to understand that a little bit. Why is movement important for humans? Why is it fundamental to our life?
Yeah, well, I think we have a biological drive to move our bodies. I mean, if we don't move our bodies, we don't really develop our systems. Like our whole musculoskeletal system has evolved for us to move, to walk on our 2 feet. That is how it's evolved. So we've evolved to do that. That's not saying we should be doing that 24/7. Like obviously we need time for rest and we need time for sleep. We need to do those things too. But yeah, clearly we have these two legs which have a ball and socket joint, which makes it very feasible to do walking and running and moving around in different directions. We have two arms that we can freely move around to throw things, to grab things, to carry things. So we should use those muscles. I mean, the only thing that's sort of guaranteed, I guess, is we have gravity acting on us all the time. So we can't really escape that. Um, and that's why our musculoskeletal system develops the way it does anyways, is to just actually counteract the gravity that we're born into. But then after that, we need to keep our bodies moving. We used to have in environmental factors that would force us to use our bodies more. So we had to do it more just to survive. So when people were doing more farming or agricultural work just to get their food, or it was their job. And now, because of advancements in technology, you can still survive. You can sit around all day and still survive. But that's not all that great, really, for your physical health or your mental health, because I think we are meant to be movers.
Moving.
Yeah.
So this is very fascinating, right? I want to be able to correlate how movement or lack of movement impacts, let's say, the brain or the mental health results of not moving. Like, is there any research, or like, can you throw some light around that?
Yeah. So I recently wrote a Substack article about that, and it's called something Exercise is Medicine for Mental Health, I think is the name
Hmm.
of that article. And I go through the evidence around physical activity for mental health. Um, think of it this way: there's a couple different ways you can assess whether physical activity is important for mental health in terms of experiments or studies. So one is, when we do survey research and we ask people who are physically active, we say, here's a list of potential reasons you might be, check off all the ones that explain why you like to do physical activity. And many people tell us in surveys that one of the reasons they do physical exercise is for stress and mood management. So people are already recognizing in themselves through introspection that one reason why I do this is because I feel better mentally afterwards. So we have that piece of information. And then what we can do is we can bring people into sort of a laboratory environment and study that. So there's two ways you can do this. It's part of a study. You can purposely reduce people's physical activity levels and see how they respond. Or through the experiment, you can purposely increase their levels. So to decrease, what you would do is you would take, let's say you've got a group of a recreational running club or a jogging club. You bring them in and you say, "Hey, we know that you all like to run a couple of times a week, but for the sake of this study, we're going to ask you for 3 weeks to not do any running. And today, I'm going to have you come in. You're going to fill out these psychological surveys, and 3 weeks from now, after you do no physical activity, or you stop doing your usual running, we're going to assess it again." And what those studies show is that people's mental health goes negative. So you restrict their physical activity that they want to do, and their mental health outcomes go down a bit. Then you can do the opposite. So you can bring people in for a study who are mostly sedentary, they're not very physically active, and you put them on an exercise program. And before and after that, let's say it's a 3-month exercise program, you measure certain mental health outcomes. And what that data now shows, we've got many studies, clinical trials, meta analyses. They show that both anxiety and depression are improved through participation in physical activity. So the totality of all that research suggests that exercise is medicine for mental health.
Phenomenal. James, I think we've utilized more of your time than what you had promised me today, but it's not going to stop here. I think we've just started touching the importance of resistance training and mental health, and there's a lot more to cover. Today, we spoke about the articles in ACSM and why men's studies are pretty low and the gynocentric world, etc. And then we touched upon why movement is important for humans. But there's more to do. We're going to understand how it neurologically impacts people, the growth of cells in hippocampus, and other aspects that I'm sure you are an expert in, which the audience would love to know, which I will schedule a time and then do sometime in the next month. Thank you so much for coming over here and sharing your views. It was fascinating to listen to all the stuff that you told about.
Thank you for having me.
See you, James. Thank you.